My name's Polly Curtis. I'm the Chief Executive at the cross-party think tank Demos. We have been around 30 years, cross-party, and we care deeply about the future of our democracy. And we hope this conversation is going to segue a bit from the state of the polls now, what's happening in the country as we speak, the prospects for the parties, and then a bit into what that means for the quality of our democracy today. And I've got three fantastic speakers to help answer these questions. Professor Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde, or as someone said to me the other day, that man off the telly. We're absolutely thrilled that John's here to take us through what we know about the state of the polls at the moment. I'd also like to welcome Sarah Castell at the end here, Chief Executive of Involve UK, which is a charity that works on participation and deliberation and approaching democracy in slightly different ways. And Miriam Levin, who is CEO at Engage Britain, which works to put people at the heart of policy making, something that's very close to our hearts at Demos as well. So it's a brilliant coalition of charities, think tanks, and Sir John here tonight to examine these issues. I'm going to start by just asking Sir John to take us through where we are in the polls. And I think Sir John's got some slides which are going to come up here. And we're going to listen to this for about 15 minutes, open up the conversation to the state of democracy, and hopefully bring in some of the audience as well. So, Sir John.
Thank you very much, Polly. This is actually going out on YouTube as well. So I think we've decided that it's easier for me if I were to sit down. It does also mean, by the way, if you do want to ask a question later on, there will be a roving mic. Those of you who have ever been virtually to a hybrid event will know that the most annoying thing is you can't hear what's being said in the room. And people who are online also have access to these slides at the same time. So what essentially I want to do is to look at why the Conservative Party is in the position it is at present, and by implication, therefore, also to try to raise the question about what does the party need to do between now and the general election, which most of us think is about 12 months away, if it is going to improve the position in which it finds itself. So what position is the party in? This has been a very unusual parliament. Usually, in a parliament, the winning party has a honeymoon for a while, and that lasts for maybe 6-12 months. But then it begins to hit trouble, and the public get discontented, and the opposition moves ahead. The extent to which the opposition moves ahead varies from parliament to parliament. And then the crucial question towards the end is, will the government get back again? It is perhaps now difficult to remember, but for the first 2 years of this parliament, the Conservative Party was never systematically and consistently behind in the polls. Things changed in the wake primarily of two events. The first is the attempt to rescue the career of Owen Paterson, followed shortly thereafter by the first news about Partygate, and within a matter of 6 weeks, the Conservative Party lost 6 points in the polls. Second event, of course, was more or less 12 months ago, in the wake of the Liz Truss fiscal event. Again, the Conservative Party lost about 6 points in a matter of 6 weeks. And as you can see on the far right-hand side, although there have been the odd sign of recovery, and there's a little bit of a sign of recovery, perhaps in the most recent polls of the last week, the Conservative Party, the Labour Party, has still got something like a 17-point lead over the Conservatives. And the zeitgeist that a lot of people are now sharing, which is, well, I presume the Labour Party is going to win the election, is only 12 months old. It's worth remembering that. Now, as a way of kind of kicking off about looking more detail about why the Conservatives are where they are, apart from the two headlines I've already mentioned, I'm going to use some polling done by Public First, which I thought was a brilliant idea. First of all, it asked people, what do you think are the best things that the Conservative governments have done since 2010? The winner by far is the relatively early rollout of the COVID vaccine. I think that's almost undoubtedly the biggest PR success and arguably substantive success as well in the eyes of the public of the Johnson administration. There are then a few other things like Brexit and holding the referendum. That's regards achievement by the government. Getting out of lockdown relatively early, so back to the pandemic. And for some people, gay marriage, although frankly that's rather more popular amongst those outside the Conservative ranks than it is inside it. And net zero gets a bit of a mention as well. But you'll notice that there's only really 3 or 4 things where the party's getting applaudance from much more than at least around a fifth of the electorate. But there are plaudits, and it's worth remembering that. What are the complaints about the Conservatives? Well, complaint number 1 is failure to do enough about the state of the NHS. Number 2 is the cost of living. Number 3 is Liz Truss and economics. Number 4 is the level of immigration, particularly a concern amongst those who voted Conservative in 2019. Brexit appears on both sides of the ledger, although in this case it's primarily people who didn't vote for the Conservatives. Oh yes, and people haven't forgotten about the lockdown parties either. So I'm going to go through most of these: the NHS, the cost of living, Truss, economics to some degree, immigration, Brexit, to see to what extent these things are actually related to people who voted for Conservatives in 2019, now no longer being willing to do so. But one thing that's already come out from my remarks is that leadership is an issue. One of the fascinating things about where we have been at for the last 12 months is that while historically it's been true that no government that's presided over a fiscal or financial crash has managed to survive at the ballot box subsequently, with the partial exception of Labour in 1950, this is the first time that a government has changed its leader in the wake of suffering a fiscal crisis and a financial crisis. And undoubtedly one of the hopes of the Conservative Party was that the relative popularity, at least of Mr. Sunak, although he was by no means as popular as he had been previously as Chancellor, would rub off on his party. Problem number 1 is that that's not what's happened. Rather, the unpopularity of the Conservative Party has rubbed off on Mr. Sunak. Basically now the Prime Minister is pretty much as unfavourable as the party he leads. So dealing with the issue of leadership, and clearly leadership is an accusation that many voters make about this party, and the quality of the leadership that it's provided in this country is still a work in progress. The economy, obviously, is one of the central complaints of the public about this government. These are YouGov's data on people's perceptions of the government's economic competence. Now, the doubts about the government's handling the economy were already there well before Liz Truss came along, arguably particularly the summer of last year, when the cost of living crisis, the impact on energy was particularly becoming prominent. People were already at that stage beginning to doubt the government's economic competence. But you then see the peak in the wake of Liz Truss, and how basically the party's reputation for economic competence has not significantly recovered from that event. Does this matter? Yes. Now, I'm going to do this kind of analysis on a number of occasions. This is not what you often people talk about. They say, what's the most important issue? They ask people. If you want to understand what are the issues that are causing a party to lose votes, that's not the right question to be looking at. What you should be looking at is, to what extent is it the case that people who hold different views about an issue, do they differ in their level of loyalty to the Conservative Party? So this is doing that analysis on economic evaluations. So on the left-hand side are those people who, this is back in last December, so this is after Liz Truss, felt that Britain's economy was basically at least doing the same, if indeed maybe doing better. 73% of Conservative 2019 voters who held that view were still loyal to the Conservative Party. And it's roughly similar for those that, well, the economy's got a wee bit worse, but it's not too bad. But amongst those who think the economy's got a lot worse, only around a half of 2019 Conservative voters were saying they're going to vote for the Conservatives again. And nearly 40% of 2019 Conservative voters, as of December 2022, felt that the economy had got a lot worse. So the economy is a problem. It's a source of this party's difficulties, and that raises the question, therefore, as to whether or not the party is going to be able to rescue its current electoral position without A, seeing material improvement in the economy, and B, being successful in claiming credit for that improvement. But the biggest issue, according to Public Services data, is the NHS. And the NHS, satisfaction with NHS has frankly fallen off a cliff. This is British Social Attitudes data released the week before the last. Over the last 40 years, every year it's measured levels of satisfaction with NHS. You know, the people who were satisfied were balanced by people who were dissatisfied in the dying years of the 79 to 97 Conservative administration. But the Labour Party eventually turned on the spending taps, they got waiting times down, and satisfaction with the health service rose to much higher levels. It's the blue line. And it was sustained for at least the first 5 or 6 years of the Conservative-led administrations. But in the wake of the pandemic and the difficulties facing the health service, satisfaction with the health service has fallen very heavily, and it's very, very easy to work out what's going on. It's waiting times what's did it. It was waiting times that was the reason for discontent before 1997, and it is again waiting times now. And this also matters, all right? People who think, 2019 Conservative voters who think the NHS has got a lot worse, are less than 50% likely to say that they will vote Conservative again, compared with 3/4 amongst those who think the NHS will get better. And yet, only as much as a quarter of 2019 Conservative voters think the NHS is getting worse. So this issue is potentially as toxic for this party as is the doubts about its economic competence. And that needs to be thought about as the party thinks about what it's going to do about tax and spend. Okay. Brexit. The foundation of this party's success in 2019 was persuading about 80% of people who at that stage who were in favour of Brexit to vote for it. That was Boris Johnson's signal success. But, and it's the grey line that matters, Brexit is now less popular. About 58% of people say they will vote to rejoin the European Union, only 42% say they will vote to stay out. And almost undoubtedly, although the trend was already in trade, the Liz Truss fiscal event did not only damage this party's reputation and economic competence, it probably also damaged the Brexit project in people's eyes, because it's become very, very difficult for people to now think of Brexit as an economic success, given what has happened. And whereas the story in the case of the Labour Party is much more complicated, and I don't want to get into it now. As you can see, even if we take current Brexit preference, and this is the second problem for the party, is that it's lost ground very, very heavily amongst people who are still in favour of leave. So there are fewer people out there who want to stay out of the European Union, but this party no longer commands that group. Less than half of people who would vote to stay out currently say they would vote for the Conservative Party. So Brexit is no longer operating as a glue that keeps people loyal to the Conservative Party. And it does therefore mean that this party, on some of this evidence, is now twice as dependent on people who would vote to rejoin the European Union amongst its current supporters than it was 4 years ago, which is something to think about. Now, and again, the other thing then to realise, which is also going on, however, is that as a party, that movement of voters away from Brexit it's not a major factor, but it also isn't helping you to retain 2019 Conservative voters. Notice the difference. If I look at the level of support for the Conservative Party amongst those people who voted leave in 2016, only 41% of that group are current Conservative supporters. If I look at it in terms of their current view i.e. the people who will now say they vote to stay out, it's still at 50%. So the implication of that is that people who voted leave in 2016, who would no longer vote to stay out, are particularly likely to have defected from the Conservatives. And indeed, as you can see, that's exactly what's happened. There aren't that many of them, so to that extent, at least, it's not as big an issue. But people who have switched away from the Conservative Party are particularly likely to be people who've changed their minds about Brexit, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why Labour's vote is still very heavily pro-EU. Still, one other issue that this party is concerned about, and which this government is currently particularly thinking it's a concern, and there is no doubt, voters for the most part think that immigration has gone up. Here's data from Redfield and Moulton. The crucial bits here are underneath. 47% of people, nearly half of people think, amongst Conservative voters, think that there's too much immigration. All right, but is this an issue which is central to people no longer voting Conservative? And the answer to that question is no. The difference, as you can see, and I've got it from two recent polls, the difference between in the level of loyalty to the Conservative Party amongst those who think that immigration is too high and those who don't have that view is very small indeed. And equally, the same is true of the issue of illegal, so-called illegal immigration. Focusing on Stop the Boats may appeal to the Conservative Party's core electorate, but getting back its core electorate is not what this party's task it's facing it. What it's got to get back are the people who've defected from it, and it is, although lots of people think immigration is too high, immigration doesn't look to be a driver, whether that is legal immigration or Stop the Boats, does not look to be a driver of the Conservatives' current electoral difficulties. Therefore, it is unlikely, at least, to be something that will help it to get back in the polls, even if the government were to succeed in reducing immigration, very difficult, or Stop the Boats, probably even more difficult. Now, I've already mentioned the state of the health service, and one of the, and of course, one of the putting money into the health service is one of the reasons why. One of the things that's happened under this Conservative administration is the biggest increase in taxation and spending since the Second World War, and putting both at record high levels. And almost undoubtedly, I think the crucial reason why Liz Truss won the leadership contest last year is because she articulated that concern, which does exist within this party. But you have to understand that the views of the public about the size of the state and about taxation and spending is primarily not ideological, it's circumstantial. And one of the things that's been undoubtedly true, and again, this is coming back from British social attitudes data, is that people's attitudes towards taxation and spending has tended historically to be thermostatic. So, as you saw earlier, in the dying days of the 79 to 97 Conservative administration, people started to get upset about the health service. They started to say, you know what, we're willing to pay a bit more because we want the waiting list to go down. Also, they wanted the schools to be better as well. Once New Labour had done that and they got the waiting list down, as you can see, gradually, as you get to the dying days of the Labour administration, the orange line becomes predominant, and increasing taxation and spending no longer becomes the most popular view. It was already the case before the pandemic, however, that the public were beginning to react against the austerity of George Osborne et al. But the fascinating thing about where we're at the moment is this, is despite the fact that we have record levels of taxation, we have not as yet seen the public react thermostatically against the increase in taxation. So again, this is another reason to think about whether actually cutting taxation, leaving aside the arguments about whether or not actually this is fiscally feasible, given the fiscal crisis we face at the moment, whether actually this is the route back to success, or at least put it like this, you might be able to cut taxes in the eyes of the public once you've managed to halve not only inflation, but waiting lists. But until you've reached that point, it is not clear that you are necessarily will be in line with the public's priorities. Now, of course, the talk about the Chancellor on Saturday about improving the NHS service and level productivity, yes, of course, all of that is also part of the story, but that's going to be difficult to achieve in the next 6 months. Another thing, of course, recently the government is focused on is the whole issue of net zero. I don't want to get into the details of that. Just simply note, the polls might have switched a little bit later. That, though, frankly, pretty much just took you back to where you were in June. The public ended up on the broad principle of Mr. Sunak's package just split. Basically, Labour voters didn't like it and Conservative voters liked it. People viewed it through a partisan lens. So far, at least, it's not clear that this is an issue, even if the government is right in articulating the fact that people are concerned about the potential impact on individuals of the cost of transition. That's undoubtedly true. But you have to ask yourself, what was there in that package that would do anything about reducing the cost of living between now and next October? And I think unless you would go back to install a heat pump, the answer to that question was probably nothing. So there's potentially a gap here between rhetoric and reality. Now, all of that said, why is it, given that the Labour Party is 17, 18 points ahead in the polls, we go, well, Labour Party might get an overall majority, they might win, but we're not quite sure. This, of course, is the answer. This is simply taking the current electoral geography and saying, well, if Labour's vote and the Conservative vote goes up and down in the same amount everywhere, what might the outcome be? And the headline, of course, is that Labour needs to be 12 points ahead on that arithmetic in order to get a majority of 1. So although perhaps getting an overall majority looks a really, really, really long way away for the Conservatives at the moment, ending up with a hung parliament, which perhaps at least might mean you might be able to get back in power sooner rather than later. Because I think, frankly, in a minority parliament, your chances of sustaining minority administration are pretty low, given the views of other parties. But a minority parliament will give you opportunities. That still seems quite high. But then a few things for you also to worry about. One of the things that we saw going on in the local elections in England in May is support for the Conservative Party was falling most heavily in places where the party was previously strongest. You want to know why you lost 1,000 seats, even though the Labour Party didn't do that one in the local election? Because you lost votes in the places you were trying to defend. Number 2, opposition voters, at the moment at least, some of them are sufficiently unhappy with the Conservative Party that they are going to be willing to vote for whatever stick is available locally to beat you with. And this is the extent of tactical voting that was going on during the English local elections. It won't be on the scale it is seeing in the parliamentary by-elections, but it's still enough potential to make a difference. And just to make you really worried, those 2 patterns of support for the Conservative Party losing ground in places it's trying to defend and voters voting tactically against it is exactly what happened in the 1997 general election. And if they do transpire, then actually Labour Party won't need a 12-point lead to get an overall majority. It will need an awful lot less than that, even if it doesn't do particularly well in Scotland. And the risks to you of doing really, really badly are probably seriously understated by that diagram I showed you earlier. So, what have you got to do? Provide effective leadership, improve the economy and claim credit for it, improve the public services, including above all the NHS, probably might like to try to persuade a few more people the merits of Brexit, although it's not crucial, and working out how are you going to counteract what is going to be potentially a much more adverse electoral geography than we might anticipate at the moment. What are the things that might divert you from your goal? Immigration, tax cuts, and probably net zero.
John, thank you so much. And just judging by the audience's faces, who were absolutely gripped by what you were saying, we all shared the that gratitude for the huge amount of detail and research you put into that. So thank you. And I'm just going to pass it over. I'm going to come back on a couple of questions questions before bringing in our other panelists. But well, as you were talking, I was ticking off Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities. So halving inflation, growing the economy, debt falling.
Yeah, well, it depends what you mean. He didn't say by when.
No.
And the last OBR report was you just about got there at the end of 5 years, and of course, the next 5 years we never get to the 5-year point. But anyway,
Waiting lists crucial. Stopping the small boats. Yeah.
So stop the boats, I said, is probably a misguided enterprise. Waiting lists absolutely crucial, but of course, because we, there are lots of reasons why waiting lists are growing, but of course the fact that we've still got poor industrial relations with the government having very successfully, arguably probably very wisely, having bought off the nurses and the ancillary health workers, has arguably failed to buy off the most crucial group of all, which is the doctors. So we're now in a standoff on that, and in the meantime, waiting lists are growing. Inflation, absolutely crucial. Growing the economy, of course. By the way, there is no anti-growth coalition. Every single party is going to campaign in the next election that we need to grow the economy more. There is no dispute. The argument is about how you get there, but everybody's in favour of growth. What was the other one I've not talked about?
No, that was all 5.
Yeah. So
I mean, that's not on there that you did talk about was leadership and how critical leadership has been to the fortunes of the party.
The honest truth is, in the end, Mr. Sunak is going to have to separate himself from both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Right? These are 2 negatives for this party. And indeed, I will point out to you now, and it might be unpopular to some people in this room, when this party failed to get behind the Privileges Committee report that said that Boris Johnson had misled the House of Commons, it's pretty much all of the progress, such as it was, that you had made in reducing Labour's lead since Mr. Sunak became Prime Minister was thrown out of the bin in one instant. That issue is still potentially toxic. I've showed you at the beginning how public first polling picks up lockdown parties as still an issue for the public. So, I would happily defend many aspects of Boris Johnson's premiership, but you need to understand electorally, it's now toxic. Liz Truss's tenure was undoubtedly toxic. The whole point of replacing Liz Truss with Mr. Sunak is presumably to try to wipe the slate clean. But the party needs to be willing to demonstrate that it is actually willing to wipe the slate clean, and has now got a different leader with a different perspective, a different style, etc., etc.
Thank you so much for that. Sarah Castell from Involve, your charity spends a lot of time out in the country listening to people, deliberating and helping people participate in policy making. So we've heard from the polls, but what are you hearing about the mood of the nation from the country, and what do you think that says about our democracy?
Thanks, Polly, and thank you for that fascinating whistle-stop tour through all the polls. I'm just still buzzing with statistics and thoughts and ideas. So I'm going to talk about something slightly depressing and then something hopefully less depressing. The depressing bit takes us out, I think, of the next 12 months into the much longer term gradual decline in trust and faith in our democracy, which we can see in a number of different pieces of research across the spectrum done by all sorts of different people here and across the world. The public in the UK, I think, feel that something is wrong with the political process. Something is wrong, but they don't feel empowered to improve it or change it. And I think there is a fairly long-term decline in trust. People love democracy still. They have faith in democracy. They believe it's the right thing to be governed by, but there's something wrong with the way it's working at the moment. So you've got research done by the RPPR saying 3 out of 5 voters want fairly substantial, large-scale political reform. You might say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they? But more people in low-income constituencies and in the red wall are saying that they want big political reform. Only 6%, I think, have said in that research that they thought everything was fine and it needed to stay the same. Work done by the Constitution Unit at UCL gives us very low trust in politicians, which has been going down for a while. I think only 18% of people trust the Prime Minister, whoever that might be, to act in the best interests of the UK. and that sort of health of democracy that's underpinning things is a little bit troubled at the moment. And so you might say, well, we just need to get politicians in that are better, right? We need to get people who people can trust, and we need to do all these things that John has said that we need to tick off. And that's probably very true. But there's also something else, that while there is this sort of decline in trust, it's very hard for politicians to move on the more complex issues that are facing our democracy. The challenges that we have are not party political challenges. Net zero isn't and shouldn't be a party political challenge. Neither is our position in the world. These are big things about our future that we need to think about together. And I think we have a very good public opinion structure playing into our democracy at the moment. But what we don't have is a public judgment structure. Public judgment. So allowing the public between elections and at other times around elections and in concord with politicians making political decisions about what the electorate think, deeper, more involved, more inclusive spaces where people can find common ground and talk about the problems that are facing us. And so then I come on to, I suppose, my more positive thing that I want to say, which is that I've seen this happen in lots of different spaces. Involved does all this work, which is around creating spaces for people to find common ground and influence politicians and influence power. And we hear, in lots of these spaces, we hear good examples of the value of sort of long-term collaborations and partnership working. And I've heard it at this conference today. People have been talking about community assets and long-term relationship building and working together with government and communities and business. The towns policy that Rishi Sunak announced earlier today could potentially be a way for people to kind of come together and be more empowered to sort of design the way that they want to live together. It may do that, it may not. It depends on the nature of that community engagement that's brought into that policy. So I think a public judgment structure could involve things like citizens' assemblies. So you've got the Irish example where that's baked into their politics, where that gives you a kind of forward look on what the public might think of a contested issue before it becomes salient in the polls. So the big example there is the referendum that was held on abortion. That on abortion was preceded by a citizens' assembly. Where the citizens' assembly came out was very different to where the general public was in the polls at that same moment. But by the time of the referendum, the general public had come on more to where that more deliberated, that more kind of in-depth discussion had happened, and that's where the public were. I think another area where these more in-depth deliberative processes can help us is that often people come to places which quite surprise politicians. So there are lots of spaces which could become very toxic, and we've just heard about lots of examples of where our politics could and does get toxic around the economy, around public services and the NHS, around Brexit or whatever. But actually, if you let people deliberate more openly and you commit to listening to them, people will come up with decisions that surprise you and which are often a lot more measured than we think they're going to be. And that gives politicians a much greater canvas on which to work, a much bigger space to operate. So a good example is wind farms. They were so sort of divisive for years, they were banned, and then even now the recent legislation has had to come quite gently towards agreeing wind farms. In Devon, they had a big minority that was saying, no, we never want wind farms, and a lot of people who didn't really mind. There was a citizens' assembly. At the end of that citizens' assembly, people supported onshore wind. I think by nearly 90% of the assembly voted for that. And that gave a mandate for politicians to then implement, and then that's gives that space for it to be more successful. Another thing to mention, is a good example, I guess, is we've just done some work with the Justice Select Committee, who are doing an inquiry into sentencing. So that committee of that select committee had a look at the polling. The polling suggests that the public are pretty hard line on sentencing, and they wanted to get under the skin of that a bit more. So we did a dialogue. We brought people together for a couple of weekends. They deliberated. They heard from experts. And the principle that they came out with was that justice for the victims was the thing that mattered most to people. So all these kind of processes, they're not giving you something to set against opinion polls. They're not saying opinion polls aren't important, but they're giving you a depth, and they're giving you a space to move that may take us a bit further, I think, than the next 12 months. So I guess I'd just finish by saying that if we do this kind of public engagement, it also has to go beyond traditional consultation. If it does that, it leads to policy that's more likely to work on the ground and deliver more value for people. So John's told us about the gap between rhetoric and reality. Well, actually, whether the policy works is what people are really bothered about, and actually whether they have more successful experiences and in their neighbourhoods and as people waiting in the hospital or wherever they might be. And the chance to develop policy that's really going to work is much, much higher if you engage people at the right point in the cycle and in more depth. So I guess my key point, I guess, is that public opinion is super important, but if we want to really heal our democracy and we want to build a stronger democracy beyond the next election, then all parties need to commit to bringing deliberative practice into the everyday process of what they're doing, not to be frightened of the public, not to think that the public will only respond in a sort of knee-jerk way to the latest announcement, but allow people to have these much more measured discussions. And that's what I think should happen, and then we'd all be happier. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Sarah. That's really fascinating. And I know, Miriam, Engage Britain, coming back to one of John's key points around health and social care and just how vital that is to the outcome of the next election. I know Engage Britain has done this deliberative public engagement around health and social care. What did you hear, and what does that tell us that adds to what we've heard through what John said?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that, but I'm actually going to start with a quote. When the health ministers and the Prime Minister and the Cabinet sit around and make these decisions about things that are going to be impacting everyone in this country, this privileged group of people sat around the table, where's Mr. Ordinary? Where's Mrs. Ordinary? And that's Harry. Harry said that. Harry was one of the members of our People's Panel. That was a citizens' assembly that we ran on health and care last year. And he summed it up much better than I ever could, kind of what the problem is, the way the public perceives the problem with our politics at the moment, and the fact that they don't have a seat at the table. People feel disenfranchised and disempowered. They don't trust politicians. Most people don't see people like them making the decisions and sitting in Westminster. And coming back to Partygate, they don't see politicians following the same rules as the rest of us. And that kind of pervades our culture. It pervades the narrative, it pervades the dialogue, it pervades a lot of the way people think about kind of our society and the way decisions are made. Now, I've also got some really depressing statistics about comparing statistics, like which ones are you going to use? Because they're all pretty depressing about the way people feel about democracy right now. They do love democracy, like it's better than the alternatives out there. But 40% of people, this is according to the University College London survey from last year, 40% of people said they're not satisfied with the way democracy works in the UK. 43% distrust the UK Parliament to make decisions in the best interests of people. It's like, that terrifies me. 43% of the population think the people who are actually making the decisions about the country don't trust them to do a good job. That should worry all of us. And 77% of people think that people like them have too little influence on how the UK is governed. So what do we do about it? That brings us back to kind of what we're here for tonight to talk about. How do we re-engage the public and rebuild trust in our democratic processes and systems? Just going to the ballot box every 4 or 5 years is no way to maintain a healthy democracy. But for me, I think it's actually really simple. I don't think this is such a tough nut to crack. For me, it's just about people being part of coming up with solutions to the problems facing the country. If we do that, the foundations of democracy are going to be that much stronger if people have an active role to play, if they're actually involved in the political decision-making, public policy decision-making that happens around the decisions that affect their everyday lives. It's not everybody being involved in every single decision. That would take forever. We've all been in those meetings where you can't agree on anything, and go round and round in circles. Not that, not on everything, and not all the time, not everybody. But opportunities for representative groups of people at different times to take on those issues, to really understand what the problems are from their perspective, those people who live and breathe it every day, understanding what the problem is, getting to the heart of the right question, and then coming up with some of the answers that might actually tackle some of these issues that we're all facing, because they've got the ideas and insights about what could be done to kind of tackle some of these issues. So I thought what I do is talk a bit more about what we've done at Engage Britain and give you a bit of an example of what I mean by all of that, because it sounds really easy in theory, and it's not really easy to do it in practice, but it is possible. So at Engage Britain, we took essentially the #1 challenge facing the country. how to make sure everybody gets the health and care that they need. And what we did over 2.5 years was show that it is possible to build policy answers from the grassroots up that really take on that challenge and really listen to people and what their questions are, what their issues are, and work with them to come up with the solutions. So we started off at the beginning of the process just answering what matters to people about health and care. So we had 101 conversations across the country involving about 700 people. And we asked them, what's working well in the NHS and social care and what isn't? They told us actually mainly about what isn't working well. But hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stories about things going wrong. And there's so much. We can all name like 12 different things, hundreds of different things about things that are not really working. And so we thought, well, we can't tackle all of these things all at the same time. So how are we going to decide what to tackle first? So Engage Britain isn't going to decide that. We put that to a people's panel. We set one up, 100 people, randomly selected, but representative of the demographics of the country, and asked them, having heard these stories that be shared through the community conversations and having listened to experts and discussed amongst yourselves, what are the priorities? What should we tackle first in terms of all of these challenges? And their top priority was that there aren't enough social care staff to meet current and future needs, which is huge. And it's one thing to identify the right questions. Obviously, the next bit, coming up with the answers, is really hard, particularly when it's an issue as difficult as this, which I'd say successive governments have been ducking for decades. What we did to try and to break the deadlock, to try and understand what to do about it, is that we used co-design. So we brought together a group of people that represented all the different parts of the system to see how they could work together to come up with answers that would work. So we had frontline care workers, people who draw on care. We had commissioners and directors of adult social services from local authorities. We had care providers. We had policy experts. We worked with them over 6 months to kind of come up with a policy package, and they did that. And it was incredible, the stuff they came out with. They had a range of solutions that they worked through, everything from quick wins, like a green badge for domiciliary care workers so they could park for free outside of their clients' homes, to big structural difficult changes like pay parity with the NHS and a 10-year staffing plan. But the point was, what they did by bringing all these different groups together and these different perspectives together, they came up with solutions that would work across the whole system. Well, not just like, if we do make this change over here, it'll work for the frontline staff, but actually the people at the local authorities can't implement it. Coming together, you have to understand what everybody's issues are and how to work together to come up with the answers. What I think is really important about kind of these different approaches to kind of democratic engagement is that this sort of deliberative process, like Sarah was talking about, it surfaces like these different priorities and kind of a more nuanced view than you get in either a focus group or a poll. It just gets you a little bit deeper because people are really complex. They can hold really kind of conflicting opinions about an issue, and that's okay. It's just about working through that and understanding what the trade-offs are. I think if we really want the public to re-engage with politics, focusing on what they think the priority issues are that affect their everyday lives, rather than kind of these wedge issues that kind of make the whole debate so toxic, is a really good place to start. So I know I, like Sarah, started like with some really depressing statistics about what's not going well in terms of people's attitudes towards democracy and about people's lack of trust in politicians and politics. But actually, I'm an optimist, and all the work that I've done gives me reason to be incredibly hopeful about this. I actually think the roots of our democratic engagement run really deep in this country. Contrary to what you can say about people being apathetic and they don't want to join in and they wouldn't actually give it the time and they wouldn't actually step up, I think most people do want to engage. The government ran a survey in 2022. In fact, they've done it every year, the Community Life Survey. And that's really interesting because it shows, it's one part of it about civic engagement, and it shows that 27% of people feel able to influence the decisions in their neighbourhood. Only 27% of people. But 53% of people think it's important that they are involved in those local decisions. And that gap, that 26% between those two numbers, that's where I feel hope. Because if we can find the ways, the opportunities for people to get involved in these decisions, they'll show up, they'll do it, and they'll get involved. So we know the push is there, the desire is there from the bottom up, from the grassroots. But actually, I think if we are going to make real change before the next election, and hopefully kind of beyond this into all the elections to come, as well as the bottom-up change, we've got to have change from the top down. You have to have people with the power in those rooms creating opportunities for people to get involved. Without this, you've got people on the outside shouting. We can hear them. In fact, right now, there's people out there shouting, and the people on the inside of these rooms just sitting there with their fingers in their ears, and that's not good enough. We have to find the politicians who are open to finding new ways of engaging people, engaging with their electorate, who want to involve people in these decisions, the decisions that really affect all of our everyday lives. The massive challenges facing our country. Politicians and policymakers who are interested in building consensus around solutions that the public will get behind. And I have absolutely no doubt there are politicians, we know politicians across all parties who are interested in this. I think it's really, really important to rebuild the public's trust in politicians. But I think it is more important, it is vital to build the trust of politicians in people.
Thank you, and thank you for that kind of inspiring example of how you've embarked on making policies differently. And it's always fascinating to me when we're talking about Demos's agenda for democratic change. Politicians will often say to us, it's not what people are asking on the doorstep. But the Ipsos monthly polling around the issues that people care about always has trust in politics. And I think the other thing that politicians tell me is that they have a really horrible experience in the world, and that people are horrible to them on social media, and they feel a real tension with society at the moment. So I really relate to what you're saying. So John, do you want to reflect on any of that, particularly around kind of?
No, why don't
Should we go out to questions? So I'd love to bring the audience in at the moment. I'm going to take questions in two, if that's okay. So I can see two hands. Gentleman in the middle here and gentleman at the back. There's a mic coming round just to make sure our online audience can hear you as well. Hello, do you want to let everyone know who you are as well?
Sure, yeah, James Bolton-Jones from the NGO Spotlight on Corruption. So yeah, underlying all of the excellent remarks by panelists is the issues around trust in democracy and the decline of it, perhaps as well, from Partygate to the own Patterson affair, which to John mentioned. How important a factor do panelists think improving standards in public life, and especially the regulation of it, is political parties looking to restore trust in democracy and convince voters that they are fit for government? Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take a second one, the gentleman in the middle as well. Might be quicker to pass it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew Caleb. I'm a trustee involved, so it goes without saying that I agree wholeheartedly with what you said. I suppose my question is, it's twofold. Let's imagine that Rishi Sunak is in the room listening to this, maybe he's joined on YouTube, and he finds the argument compelling. How would the Conservatives come up with a policy that demonstrates that they want to involve the public far more? Because it's an important, essential point, but it's very nebulous as well. So what is it that they tangibly could do? Is it something with the House of Lords? Is it replacing the House of Lords with the House of Citizens? Is it institutionalising people's assemblies at local level? And then the second part of the question is it possible for Rishi Sunak to demonstrate leadership in the way that we've heard Sir Richard Curtis saying he needs to, while simultaneously being perceived to be giving it away or sharing it more widely in a way that I think is clearly needed?
I'm going to ask Sir John to come in on standards in public life, and Sarah, but I'm not going to have asking involved questions. So if Miriam can come back on that would be brilliant. Thank you. Sir John.
One of the criticisms made of Boris Johnson's premiership was a relative degree of disregard for both rules and constitutional practice. Most vividly illustrated or stroke dramatized when the prorogation of Parliament in September 2019 was ruled illegal by the Supreme Court. Now, I think one has to say, however, that this is perhaps not as straightforward an issue as we might anticipate. I said earlier, I can think of grounds on which we would defend Mr. Johnson's premiership. And it's both a strength and a weakness, is that he was outcome focused, i.e. he wanted to get things done. And he was more concerned with getting them done than how we got there, and particularly having regard for constitutional convention, etc., for doing so. And that style worked for quite a while. It worked over the prorogation thing, despite it being ruled illegal, because at least half the country felt that what he was doing was right, because they felt that Parliament was trying to stop Brexit. Frankly, one of the reasons why the opposition criticism of the administration's practice with the acquiring PPE during the pandemic never really got very far is that most people wanted medics to have PPE, and they frankly didn't care how it was acquired or whatever. The crucial thing was getting that PPE in. Equally, the fact that the government engaged in some procurement processes with respect to vaccines that might be regarded as not necessarily showing due fiscal responsibility for the public purse, because basically we bought a lot of vaccines that we had no idea whether any of them would actually work or not. But in the end, well, actually not one, but two of them did, at least to a degree, meant that it was regarded as, as I've already said, this is now regarded as one of the government, the Conservatives' greatest success since 2010. So all of that, and again, we all of us wanted the PPE, and we all of us wanted the vaccine so we could go back to live our lives. Where it began to come unstuck, and where, as it were, we need to there are two lessons from this. Where it began to come unstuck was when we discovered that Number 10's interpretation of lockdown regulations was basically different from everybody else's. Okay, and together with trying to defend an MP who had a second job. There is no constituency out there for people who think we should be nice to MPs who have second jobs, and there certainly wasn't any constituency out there for a more liberal interpretation of the COVID regulations during the height of the pandemic. Now, I think almost undoubtedly one of the conclusions that those who worry about the Constitution, which it's true, Polly, it's a minority who worry about it. But one of the things that they are worrying about is whether the lesson of the Johnson administration is that we're going to have to rely less on convention and more on law and regulation about the powers of government, the powers of Prime Minister, etc., etc. That's point one. But the second lesson from all of this is that, frankly, we only get concerned about standards in public life when somebody is breaking the rules to do something that we don't believe in. And the fact that in particular the prorogation incident, those people who were in favour of Brexit felt the Supreme Court was wrong, and those people who were opposed to Brexit thought the Supreme Court was right, is a very, very clear illustration. The problem is, though, in the end, a relatively small section of the electorate actually have consistent views about the principles of democracy. In the end, their views about legitimacy or otherwise of any particular action is a function of what they think the substantive consequences of that rule will be. And that, therefore, in a sense, is going to be the challenge for any programme of political reform. In the end, people will regard it through, a substantive lens. But certainly, many people would argue that one of the lessons of the government of 2019 to 2022 is this that needs a degree of attention.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I'm so excited to come in on this. Thank you. Yes, I completely agree that people look at the decisions through the lens of what they'd like to happen anyway. I do think we are at quite an interesting sweet spot in history now, as the questioner suggested, that there is an appetite for greater scrutiny. There is an appetite for Parliament to be strengthened. And I think that there are ways that that you could bring the public in. And this kind of also answers the other question about how could the Conservatives demonstrate that. Rishi Sunak could say, I am going to look at the Code of Conduct, I'm going to look at the Committee on Standards, I'm going to look at the Privileges Committee, I'm going to run citizens' juries to come up with what the principles are that do underpin that. Because Sir John's absolutely right, people don't have a set of principles that they can roll out and they can all agree on. But if you bring them together to deliberate on it, we will find something that people don't disagree on, and something that feels like something that ordinary lay people can have a voice in. And if politicians could stand up and say, we will adhere to this, we will make sure that these committees go by these principles that we've worked up, with the aid of our public, with the aid of the people of this country, who can have a view. They can't necessarily have a view on incredibly technical things always, unless they're helped by lots and lots of expertise and support. But everyone can have a view on what is good behaviour and what is playing by the rules. And the slipperiness of those things, I think, partly now is because we have relied on convention, and the convention is proving to be built on sand because bad actors can go against that convention. And this is why we need to bring this to the public and say, this is for you to decide how we want to live, what is fair play, what is British fair play and good behaviour that we want to see, and people have the common sense to be able to do that.
Miriam, do you want to add anything on how you would institute more public participation in policy making and democracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's loads of different ways. Depends on how brave you want to be, really. I mean, you could take, so in East Belgium, they've instituted deliberative democracy into the way they do government, and it's amazing. So you have a standing citizens assembly, essentially, that does agenda setting. So that's an amazing moment to involve the public. So what do people really care about? Okay, what they care about when they, again, it's not just the knee-jerk kind of what was on the headline that morning kind of priority, but after some time to consider and deliberate and think about it, people from all different ends of the political spectrum coming together to talk about it, allowing them to set the agenda, like, well, actually, what's really important? What do we need to sort out in this country? Good moment. There's also, as you go through the legislative process, having pre-legislative deliberations. So if you know you're making like legislation and policy around a particular issue, talk to the people who are going to be impacted by that legislation, those people on the front line, the people who are going to be affected by it, the people who've got to try and enact that legislation, and find out, well, where are the bear traps? What are the hurdles? What are the things we have to think about? Because actually, if you're sitting in Whitehall, and I've been a civil servant, I've sat in Whitehall and created policy, your perspective is really partial, right? You only know what you know. To open that up to kind of the collective intelligence of a much wider segment of the population who really know this stuff because they live it and breathe it every day, that's going to give you kind of better ideas and better ways into creating policy or legislation that's actually going to work for people. So I think there's plenty of moments to do it. And the time not to do it, I would say, the point I want to make, is when you've basically already made up your mind what you're going to do, and this is what the policy is going to be, and then you consult on it. And you tell people, so how much do you like the thing that I'm going to do? Do you like it a lot or really, really loads? It's like, no, please not that. Just bringing it back in the process where people could actually help set the agenda, help add in their ideas in a really meaningful, really involved way. So they've actually got a chance to be part of the conversation, not having it kind of laid upon them in a way they have got no influence over.
Thank you. I'm going to take two more questions before we wrap up. Our friend at the front here and the gentleman at the left. And if we can squeeze it in, the lady on the right as well, please. Oh, well, we got to you first. Sorry. We will get to all three now.
I wanted to ask something about statistics. So, there's a topic that wasn't there, and I was surprised not to see that. And I wondered, are the public asked and given a free rein as to say what is the most important thing to them? Or are they given certain subjects and saying, what do you think about this?
What subject do you think was missing?
Well, if I just say, and you'll correct me, no doubt, on this, my understanding is that a female vote is particularly important to Conservatives. And one of the topics at the moment, which affects women and children, is the gender issues. That comes up an awful lot when you're talking to women. And I just wonder.
Oh, you mean this is the argument about gender? This is the argument about gender recognition, yeah?
I'm sorry.
Is this the argument about gender recognition?
Well, well, and what's happening in schools.
Yeah, okay, fine. All right, that's fine. I'm just trying to make sure I'm. That's fine.
And well, Andrew, if you can bring the mic to the front, and then we'll go to the gentleman on the back. Thank you.
So I was wondering, I know that you helped organise the Citizens' Assembly in Jersey on assisted dying, and obviously assisted dying is something that's repeatedly been shown in polls in the UK as having over 2/3 majority. Do you feel like, I know the debate, the Assembly in Jersey had quite a positive outcome. Do you think that that's something that would happen in, well, number one, happen in the UK? Number two, is it something that the MPs in Westminster would take into account? Our Citizens' Assembly is something that they do value the results of. As you were saying about listening to members of the public, is our Citizens' Assembly is something that would move the debate forward on an issue such as assisted dying.
Thank you, and the gentleman on the.
Thank you very much. We heard from Sir John earlier about the impact of classical voting and the science of electoral geography, and I wondered to what extent do those speak to the way the current electoral system is failing, even on its own terms? And supplementary, if sort of forced to do so, how would you, as panelists, go about convincing Conservatives to embrace electoral reform?
I am going to say to our friend at the front, there are 3 people here who would love to talk to you in great detail about citizens' assemblies and will be around afterwards. If anyone else wants to pick up on those forms of electoral reform, we're really keen to have that discussion afterwards. But coming to John on the gender question, is that coming up spontaneously?
Well, can I have a go at all 3?
No, go for it.
So the technical answer to your question is that the Ipsos Mori annual issues index, which I wasn't using, which asks people, what are the most important issues facing the country, that doesn't give people a list. It asks people to say what they think are the most important issues. I can't remember where gender recognition comes on that list. It certainly isn't at the top. It's things like cost of living and the economy and the NHS, etc. But that's where you will see people being given the chance to say whatever they say. The 2 things, the 2 figures I showed from Public First about achievements and negatives, that was a prepared list, and I could have a go at it too. I wish they'd had something about taxation on their list, but there we go. It isn't perfect, but there are advantages and disadvantages to the 2 ways of doing it. On assisted dying, first thing we should say absolutely straight away, this is a difficult subject for a lot of people. But beyond what's happening in Jersey, there is another attempt being made in Scotland through a private member's bill. A number of the MSPs who voted against it last time have changed their minds. And I think there is now a widespread expectation, although it will take a while, that perhaps it will go through the Scottish Parliament this time. Whether that will result in another argument with the UK Parliament about different laws on difficult subjects on both sides of the border, who knows? But that debate's going on. And the quantitative evidence. The public are in favour of assisted dying in very limited and very specific circumstances. It really is essentially, a diagnosis of death within a very short period of time, although we all know that medically that's not always certain, and where the person's able to exercise it. What would I do to convince the Conservative Party on electoral reform? Well, I won't give you the whole spiel on my views on electoral reform. Basically, what I would say to the Conservative Party is that if you believe in majoritarian government, which is fine, I think there are different views about how democracy should be run, right? And there's more than one way you can engage in electoral reform. My disagreement with the current electoral system is that it relies on a certain electoral geography in order to achieve a majority for parties. And the problem we have at the moment, which I can't go into, is we've got an enormous range of potential results at the moment that could result in a hung parliament, which is not what the current system is meant to achieve. If you believe in majoritarian government, you should be in favour of an electoral system that is more or less guaranteed to deliver majoritarian government. See Greece, see Italy. I know I can see a few people in this room going, what? Yeah, these are countries that have electoral systems that are deliberately disproportional. But the only way you can do that, and this is the crucial rub, the only way you can achieve any systematic relationship between seats cast and votes won is if you're willing to give up single member constituencies. That's the real debate, whether you want a proportional system or a majoritarian system. The crucial thing you have to accept is that you cannot achieve that through single member constituencies, because you have to have a way of allocating votes to parties in a systematic manner across a widespread geographical territory. And you cannot do that with a single member party system. So that's how I come at it, but it's a very, very particular view.
I'm conscious that we're just up against time now, and I want to say a huge thank you to our panelists and to the audience for those really brilliant questions. I think like some of what Sir John shared really surprised me about some of the counterintuitive things around immigration, tax cuts and net zero not being necessarily the electoral slam dunk that they're being treated at the moment, and the centrality of leadership to the party's prospects being so key. And actually, as I was listening to Sarah and Miriam, I also was thinking, how much in the public's mind might there actually be a through line between leadership and the sense of our trust in democracy and how much we're thriving as a democratic nation as well? Just was a question that popped up in my mind. I wanted to leave you with one recommendation, which is Sir John's new podcast, Trendy, from Tortoise, which is the most fantastic listen. You get to hear him talking about all the things he's been talking about today in huge detail. So hugely recommend that. Thank you for coming to this Demos event, and do stick around for a drink afterwards. Thank you, everyone. Are you enjoying the podcast?
Yes. I mean, Rachel's fantastic.
Do you know that I was one of the founding editors at Tortoise?
How were you?
Like my questions hooked us with.
It was James Harding's idea.
Yeah. Okay. Should we turn them on?